So now, please press your button and tell us what you think. And while the system is totting up your opinions, I'm going to hand over to Matthias to take us through the talk.
Stefan für die Einleitung. Ja, da haben wir auch schon.
Thank you very much for the introduction. Now we've already got a result. It's pretty clear. Most people think we should at least try. So, a positive mood. The skeptics are obviously in a minority here. I'm looking forward to see whether that's still the case at the end of this discussion, which I'm sure will be very interesting. So, could I first of all welcome you most warmly? And I'm looking forward, first of all, to introduce you to this issue. It's an issue which isn't only really up to date, but I think is also important and is bound to keep us busy for the next few years. So to give us an idea about what this is actually about, let me start with some data. If we look at the global situation, currently about 60 million people have fled their homes. That's more than ever before. At least half are what we call internally displaced people. That is, they are displaced within their own country. They are migrants within their own country. They have no international protection. And every day, on average, 42,500 people become refugees, which just goes to show, if you think about those figures, what order of magnitude we are talking about and how many refugees there are out there and what problems we are going to have to tackle. If we break those figures down a little bit for Europe, first of all, we have to say that only a fragment of those who have fled their homes are coming to Europe or have come to Europe. Last year, we had 3 million applications throughout Europe. And you know that, or we think that they're all coming to Germany, but actually, if you look at the figures, we can see that Sweden has been taking most, followed by Hungary, Austria, Malta, and Denmark, and only then Germany. Nevertheless, it's quite clear that, particularly in the last year, the number of refugees in Germany, too, has increased hugely. You can see that those are the applications for asylum that have been placed from 2008 onwards, and they doubled last year. But you can see that they were already growing quite fast. So this is a huge challenge in Germany and Europe, and I think globally. The question to ask is, what can the tourism economy contribute to help, or at least in its own way make a contribution to getting to grips with this situation in Europe and globally? Question is, what can we do? I think there are 3 places that we can start out. One would be to think about how the tourism industry can contribute to combating the reasons why people leave their homes. What can they do in the destinations? Of course, I'm not talking so much about Syria or Afghanistan, more about countries in the Balkans or Egypt, Myanmar, where, again, a lot of refugees are setting off for Europe. That would be one thing that we could do. Another approach would be to think about what can the tourism economy do here in Germany to facilitate integration. And the third point is, what about reintegration? When refugees who've been in Germany for a time decide in the foreseeable future to go home again, what can we do both here and in those home countries to help? They're all complex issues, so today we need to focus on one. What we're going to do today is look primarily at this question: what can the tourism industry do to facilitate integration here in Germany? And to look at that question, first of all, we need to bear in mind who is actually coming. I've been using the term refugees so far because that's what they normally talk about in the debate, but that's not actually precise. We need to differentiate. We talk about refugees. We also talk about asylum seekers who come to us. There are also people who are what they call tolerated in Germany. That means that they're given a temporary stay of deportation on particular grounds. And then there are people who are eligible for subsidiary protection under international treaties, and then there are migrants. Those are all very different groups, and we must differentiate between them if we want to start thinking about how to facilitate their integration in tourism. So just briefly, let me be a little more precise about what they are, who they are, and what their legal status is. Let's begin with refugees. Are those who are being persecuted in their home country, whether because of their ethnic origin, their religion, their nationality, or because they belong to a particular social group. And all those who are recognized in our country as refugees are given a 3-year temporary residence permit, which is then reviewed after that time. And if they can remain longer, they can at least apply for a permanent residence permit in order to live permanently in Germany. Now let's look at the asylum seekers. Who is entitled to apply for asylum? What is asylum? People can apply for asylum if they are politically persecuted in their country. That is, if the government in their country doesn't like my opinions, my attitudes, and I get marginalized or oppressed in some way, my human rights are trampled on. If that's the case, I can apply for asylum in Germany, and this is looked at on an individual case-by-case basis. And if I am allowed to stay like a refugee, I will be given a temporary residence permit for 3 years. In the case of asylum seekers, it's also important to notice that since January 2015, there is no requirement for a mandatory residence. In the old days, people used to be sent to a particular place and they had to stay there. Now, after 3 months, you can move around Germany, which makes it easier, of course, to look for a job. But it's not just those 2 groups that play an important role. We have to look at 3 more groups. There are those who are given a temporary stay of deportation. What does that mean? These are people who have made an application for asylum, but they were turned down. But it may be that nevertheless they are not deported or cannot be deported for very specific reasons. The reasons might be they've lost their passport, or they cannot be transported for reasons of health, or maybe there are no transport links with their home country. There are certain conditions which mean that people cannot actually be deported, and they are then granted a temporary stay of deportation and therefore temporary right to stay in Germany. Then there are people who are not recognized as refugees and whose asylum application has been turned down, but still can't be deported because they are entitled to subsidiary protection. That means if, for example, they fear for their lives, or if it can be assumed that if they go back to their home country, they run a real individual risk of suffering serious injury or losing their life, torture, for example, then they are eligible for subsidiary protection and can stay temporarily in Germany. For example, if they face a death penalty, or if there's a danger that I might face torture if I return to my country. The 5th group are the so-called migrants. What do we mean by migrants? Migrants are generically those who come to Germany in the hope of improving their living conditions. Usually people talk about economic refugees, but they are in the most difficult situation because they are unlikely to get any kind of a legal status here in Germany, let alone the right to work. So you can see we've got very different groups here with different legal status. Nevertheless, we need to ask, what kind of integration is needed? What's important to integrate people into our society for a longer period? First of all, there's language, of course. They learn German. But of course, also, how do we put our values across? How do we raise awareness for our value system? Second point is giving people a chance to establish social contacts and to build social relations. Give children a chance to go to nursery or school, and then accommodation, not just in hostels or shelters for refugees, but to give them a prospect of having a flat of their own. And then, of course, the question, how can we help them with training? Can we make it possible for people to go to university? And then ultimately the question, how do we integrate them into the labour market? An important thing to note here is that integration doesn't mean assimilation. It doesn't mean that if people come here, we can expect them to adapt totally and to discard their cultural identity. Integration means that simply that we need to make sure that there is a framework there to enable people who come to us to be integrated and in the long term, for a certain period or permanently, to build a new life. Now here again, there are lots of complex questions about this. And again, we're going to have to focus today. So we're going to look primarily at training and integration into the labour market. And if we go into a bit more depth about that and ask what rules we need to observe, there are 3 points that we can break this down to. The first point is that for most refugee groups, it is not possible within the first 3 months of arriving in Germany to take up any employment. That applies to those who are applying for asylum. It applies to those with a temporary stay of deportation and those with subsidiary protection. None of those people are allowed to work for the first 3 months in Germany. A second point which is important is what we call the secondary access to the labour market. That means that the groups I've described are given secondary status in the labour market. That means that after month 4, they can apply for a work permit, but there is a restriction. That means that the employment office will look to see whether they can be given any priority on the labour market or not, because priority is normally given to German citizens, EU citizens, and recognized refugees. So if you're an asylum seeker, or you have a temporary stay of deportation, or you have protected status, you can only get a job if nobody else wants it, basically. There are some exceptions. These relate to recognized refugees. They can take up employment without waiting. And also, there is an exception with regard to vocational training. Asylum seekers can start vocational training after 3 months. Those who have subsidiary protection or a temporary stay of deportation can do this on the very first day that this status is recognized. And everyone who's been in Germany for more than 15 months no longer have to be reviewed to see if they can have priority for a job. They can go for any job they want on an equal basis. So this is important if you're a potential employer. You need to differentiate and understand what you can do, with whom, where. Now, if we try to sum that up and ask what are the major obstacles to labour market integration, then I think it's the following points. First of all, the length of time it takes for an asylum procedure. It usually takes 5 months in Germany, which means that's longer than anywhere else, or longer than the average in the EU. It's usually difficult for people who come to us to achieve a legal status rapidly, and of course the same applies to their employer. That's something that has to be dealt with. Second point, I've already mentioned. There is no right to enter employment for the first 3 months for most people. Then we have this priority principle, that they don't have priority on the labour market if they have subsidiary protection or are asylum seekers. Another point we need to mention is if I want to be self-employed, it's almost impossible as a refugee to set yourself up as self-employed for formal reasons. And also, if I am in training, I can probably complete that training, but there's no guarantee that I will get a job afterwards. There are big constraints there as well. And one last factor, which concerns the universities, again, the bar is set very high there. If you want to study at a university, again, there are lots of obstacles to overcome to have that opportunity. Something else that I should mention, and it's relatively precarious, is the fact that the people who come to us are not systematically recorded. We don't know what education they have or what skill qualifications our refugees have. So we don't exactly know who they are or how they're skilled. So the discussion about the Syrian engineer is just as obsolete as the theory that most people don't have any skills at all. We don't exactly know because, as I say, there is no system for keeping a record. So those are the essential obstacles we need to bear in mind. Nevertheless, we do have a few other problems, and I ought to mention those in order to complete the picture before we start the discussion. We have 614,000 vacancies in Germany, and we have about 37,100 training places that haven't been filled, which again is a record. So you might say, well, that's fantastic. We can use those open places to integrate more refugees. But it's not that simple, because if you look at on the other side, that we've got nearly 3 million unemployed and 20,900 young people who haven't found a training place. In other words, regardless of the refugee situation, we have some problems here in our labour market, getting people into training or into the labour market. And if we look at the situation in tourism and the hotel trade, in 2007 we had 107,000 trainees who completed their training, or who were in training. 46,000 new trainees, new places were created during that year. That had changed a lot by 2013. Only 63,000 trainees and 27,500 new places that year. So we can see quite clearly that it's difficult to encourage young people to train in this sector, which of course has long-term consequences for the availability of skilled labour. And the last point, which one must not ignore, is the sword of Damocles hanging over our heads, which is demographic change. We have the problem that our population is going to gradually decrease, and at the same time, we are going to get older on average. So we're assuming that by 2050, in Germany, there'll be 7 million fewer people. And apart from South Korea and Japan, we are the country where demographic change is having the greatest impact, or having the fastest impact. So something needs to be done about that. And if we look at the fact that at the moment, for every 100 employable people aged between 20 and 64, there are 35 retired people. By 2040, that number will have increased to almost 56. So quite apart from the refugee question, we are heading for a quantitative and qualitative problem. Quantitative in terms of the availability of labour, and qualitative in terms of skilled labour, which brings us to today's theme. First, how can we, with the help of the tourism industry, do more to integrate refugees in our labour market and to train them? And the second question is, can the integration of refugees help to resolve the problem we are gradually seeing emerge with a shortage of skilled labour? Those are the questions that will be in the focus today. Thank you very much so far. I'm looking forward to the discussion with my fellow panelists. Might I ask Mr. Scholz and Mr. Mascudi to come up here on the platform first for a brief interview? Well, welcome to you. First of all, can I introduce you? We have Dr. Burkhard Scholz, who is the manager of Insel Hotel Potsdam in Hermannswerder, and Mr. Ezzatullah Mascudi, who is training as a chef at Insel Hotel Potsdam in Hermannswerder. Welcome to both of you. Can I start with you, Mr. Mascudi? You're from Afghanistan. You came to Germany, and as I said, you are now training as a chef. Can you just tell us what prompted you to leave Afghanistan, and why did you come to Germany, of all places? Hello, ladies and gentlemen. It's a good question. There are a number of different aspects why I left my home country. I wanted to say to you that I'm a journalist by profession, and I have 10 years of experience as a journalist. I also worked for women's rights in Afghanistan, and we developed a number of projects for women's rights. And in October 2012, I was injured, and I was doing my work, and in February 2014, my father was kidnapped and later killed, and that's when I left my home. I had been also an active member of a democratic party in Afghanistan from 2006 until 2014. You said you applied for asylum, but the procedure isn't yet completed, so you have to wait for the final decision. But you are in training now. What made you decide to be a cook? You said you're a journalist, so why did you decide to be a cook? I'm new in Germany. My German wasn't so good. It's enough for the training, and I'm very pleased that I can now do a training in that trade. Of course, when I talked to Mr. Scholz, he said, "Would you like to do this training?" I said, "Yes, I'd like to do a training. I'd like to come to you to Insel Hotel." And since December, the 1st of December 2015, when I started my training in Insel Hotel, I'm doing that now, and I'm really enjoying it. And I'd like to thank Dr. Scholz for this assistance. You said you met Dr. Scholz. How did that happen? How did you meet? And what was it that prompted you to say, "I'm going to give Mr. Mascoudi a training place"? What requirements did you have? Well, first of all, I'd also like to say a warm hello to everybody in the room. It's a good thing that we have a chance to address this issue a bit from the practical point of view. Of course, the prime thing is I'm a Christian, and I know that we need to help a lot of people. That is our duty. But to me, it was also an economic necessity. A lot of colleagues, maybe there are some of them among you, know how difficult it is to find young people who want to work for the hotel and hospitality trade. Partly because they're not very family-friendly hours. People have to work on holidays. They have to go to work. And the pay isn't that good. You have to call a spade a spade. So we need people who come to this country with an open, happy heart and a smiling face to look after our guests and to be there for our guests. It's getting harder and harder to find skilled personnel. So last year, when the refugee wave really picked up, we recognized that there was an opportunity there for us. And I tried to talk to a number of institutions about it. I began by going to the department that's responsible for foreigners in the state of Brandenburg, which is our Land in Germany. But they were kind of waiting to see, and I went on to the employment agency, and I found it very surprising to see that all the doors were open, and they were organizing discussions in the job center. The first big meeting, there were supposed to be 15 people who'd expressed an interest in working in hospitality, but 30 came along. And something else that surprised me even more was that a lot of those people had only been in Germany for a few months. But they could already speak the language almost as well as we can in this room, and that really impressed me. Also, they were very friendly and full of hope. And that's why I think we should seize this opportunity. I can only say today that during the period, we've offered a number of people a chance to get started on something, but we've seen that there are stones that we stumble across. There are religious concerns, there are cultural hurdles, big ones. For example, to illustrate that, In our hotel, we have a lot of female employees, including in managerial positions. And often men would not give them their hand to shake. And when refugees were asked about that, they would offer excuses. But we were quite sure that they weren't prepared to change their attitude. So I have to say it is a thorny path. And we look for people who are prepared to accept our values. We can't serve tea in a restaurant. Let me say it, we had cases. I'm not trying to joke with you here. We had two people who, for religious reasons, they were Muslims, but they were not able to serve alcohol to guests. They could not hand over a glass of alcohol. They simply couldn't do it. It made them sick. They actually couldn't do it. These were experiences that we all had, but I have to say, on the positive side, that we also have problems with some of our German applicants. So when I say this, this is just to offer you a glimpse, because anyone who wants to go down this road with refugees, you need to be aware that there will be thorns in the path. But we notice with German applicants too that it's getting harder and harder to meet with the understanding and willingness we need. Thank you. Mr. Mascoudi, you said that you're a journalist. Now you're training as a chef. Question, what are you going to do later? I'm not quite sure what to do with these two things, the journalism and the cooking. Do you have any plans for what you're going to do once you've finished your training? When the training is over, I will start working. And while I'm working, I want to continue my education as a journalist on the side. I see, so you want to do both. You want to work as a chef. Could you imagine ever going back to Afghanistan, or do you see your future here in Germany? I can't go back to Afghanistan because my idea is so different. It's not, what can I say? I have so many problems with Islamic parties, Islamic organizations, and unfortunately, I can't go back to Afghanistan. So thank you very much for this brief interview. Mr. Scholz, perhaps you'd like to take a seat here. Thank you for the interview.
Sie können gleich wieder, wir machen.
But feel free to join me on the panel, Mr. Scholz, because I'm going to invite also other panelists to join me. I think you have to sit in a special order because you've been wired up by our technicians. Excellent. So welcome, gentlemen, to this panel. Allow me to introduce yourselves. To my left is Norbert Fiebig, who's the president of the German Travel Association, DRW for short, and next to Mr. Fiebig, a very warm welcome, Christian Wiesenhütter, who's the deputy chief executive of the Chamber of Industry and Commerce of Berlin. Next is Dr. Kai Ruger, who works for the German Association of County Parliaments. Now, we've already started this discussion, and I'd like to recap some of it and like to focus really on three aspects in this upcoming discussion. Let's talk about the opportunities and risks first, then put our minds around the challenges and problems and what our industry can do to offer labor opportunities for refugees. Now, let me get started with Mr. Wiesenhütter. There's many refugees that have come to this country, and one way or the other, we have to train them. We have to integrate them in the labor market. Now, if you take a general perspective of the national economy, the opportunities and risks, what is predominating here? The opportunities or the risks? What do you think? I don't think there's any way forward other than making good use of the opportunities we have. Now, for those who are most likely to stay in the countries, the Syrians, and out of those populations, you take the share of people that are well educated, which is the majority of them, And also young people, share of young people below 25 years of age is 50%. So if you extrapolate that, you can be pretty sure that we are going to close the lack of skilled labor by 10%. That's not an awful lot, but still it is quite something. And I think we should all be positive about it. Now, one of the biggest problems there is to convince people, so younger people, to go for an apprenticeship after those waiting times that you've indicated before in the asylum process. So to be motivated to go for that is not an easy thing to do. So those who are arriving as children these days are just riding the bicycles. They have to be prepared for that normal or standardized process. And I've seen that for myself, so that's not problem. Integrating older generations is difficult because they've come to the country, they have received in the asylum, an asylum status, and they want to make money. There's a minimum wage in this country. There's simple jobs, in quotes, that we all like in the security profession, where they can, get employed rather quickly. Now, in the hotel and hospitality industry, as you've said, you need more qualified people. And the question is that the target group? Yes or no? It's hard to say. We know that for most refugees, they have worked before in the arts and crafts. So now this is something that that can be obviously also catered to. We had illiterate people, but there are still excellent carpenters and joiners. So something that we haven't touched on yet is language, linguistic skills. People need to be able to speak the German language. That's ever so important. We must focus on that. And I think we have been overtaxed lately because we don't have enough language teachers who can teach them those language skills. Okay, you said we should be positive and outgoing. Mr. Phoebe, what would you say from the point of view of the travel industry? Is that the same view? Do you share that position? I absolutely do, is the answer. Because the statement we've just heard about language skills is really key. When you think about the travel industry and look at the different segments we have there, well, in the foreseeable future, there may be a problem to recruit new staff, and that's in travel agencies, where we have potential job requirements, really clever people that have to be well-trained clerks, travel industry experts. We don't really see a big need for academically trained staff, so higher education. So I think in the next 20 years or so, there probably will not be an awful lot of job vacancies, so we can fill those positions with the existing workforce we have in this country. But when we talk about bottlenecks, then it's probably be the travel agents, and this is where language does matter. You cannot, sitting in front of a customer, B2C contacts at a counter, because that's very important in the tour operators and the travel agency industry, but also in the hospitality industry. When you're in direct customer contact, you need to be able to speak the language to contact or to engage with your customers. And it's not like, knowing the language so-so. It is fundamental skills. If you need to consult your customer in a travel agency, you need excellent language skills. So therefore, I agree with my colleague when he says that that is a problem that cannot be solved overnight, or not even in 1, 2, or 3 years. We'll see it's going to take a generation to solve. So we're talking about, 10, 15 years. Young people coming to the country have to be get integrated into the social system of the country, the culture, the education, and it has something to do with linguistic skills. Don't be oversimplified about it. In-migration doesn't solve our problems in terms of vacant jobs. At least in the medium term, that's not going to happen. So to solve the problem in a structured fashion, what we need is not something that is currently addressed by that awful migrant and refugee crisis. Namely, we need good training and upgrading of skills that we've seen in other countries as well. Canada, Australia, they've installed some very useful systems which are catering to the labor market. refugees and resources we have available are relatively limited. We've just seen an example a moment ago. It's a great example, but if you will, you're a very well-trained intellectual, if you will, and your language skills have been good before. I'm sure you spoke good English when you arrived in this country, and there's not an awful lot of people like you. Again, I'm not going to engage in any type of social romanticism, but I know some figures here that have been provided by the minister in the state of Hesse. He says 40% of newcomers are illiterate. Right. Until you have those illiterate people with the level of skills that they can take up a qualified job, it's not only language, but it's mostly about language, will take a long time. And it's a huge task, a gargantuan task, I should say, which is not going to be solved overnight. And certainly not. You can expect that question to solve, in the short term. It will be solved over time. And don't get me wrong, we need to solve that issue. This is a humanitarian task for all of us, but we will solve the problem over a longer period of time. Okay, let me come back to what you said. You said social romanticism there, Mr. Ruger. If you look at towns and cities in the country where their problems are, and one is pretty sure when you look into the rural areas, there's also lacking staff, lacking skilled force, skilled labor in the hospitality industry. Do you think there is an option to find good synergies between the integration of refugees for one thing and to solve, or at least to solve, the problem of skilled labor shortage on the other hand? Or is it just social romanticism that we're discussing here, as Mr. Ruger says? I don't want to disillusion you, but let me start with a positive outlook. Our towns and cities are working in a perfect way to accommodate refugees. So far, things are going really well. And this is thanks to the local commitment and to our communities in these countries that have made that possible. Of course, we have major problems in administrating the problem, but this is on the part of the Federal Office of Migration and Refugees. It's not on the community level. It's working really well on the local level. But someone said social romanticism. You are suggesting that we can solve the lack of skilled labor with refugees. It's not true. No, we don't have blue card or green card holders. We don't have qualified influx, if you will. It's humanitarian refugee movements. And it's right why we're doing that, The question of whether the order of magnitude is right, I leave open for discussion. You said we had 70,000 applications, but we're talking about an administrative gap of 500,000 migrants who are only just writing their applications. So in the final analysis, we're talking about 1 million migrants, refugees from a different situation, from a different culture, from a different work-life history. So any statistics and profiling you're doing, and which some of that we've done already, indicates that 80% of people arrive here without a formal education or formal training. Now, no matter how you interpret that, I would also agree with you. Syrians, on average, are better qualified, are better trained, and with Syrians we have a higher recognition rate of asylum seekers. But generally, it's a huge task. And I don't want to throw in the towel at all, but when you look at rural communities, which we also represent with our association, we need to make good use of potentials if we have a good planning horizon and know how many people we need to absorb. So if you said the residence rule has been given up, we think this is the wrong signal. We're actually quite for that. After the end of an asylum proceedings, we keep a residence rule. With 1 million people, these cannot be integrated in Frankfurt or Cologne or Berlin. It's impossible, full stop. But the chances in rural communities are that you can actually plan for a certain contingent of people for whom you can offer integration measures and courses and training. So, you know, here's my resources. There's places in nursing schools, language classes, etc. Something that cannot be done in one single city. You need to disperse that, distribute that, plan it in rural areas, because this is also where tourism is taking place, by the way, not in the big cities, but in the smaller communities. And this is exactly what Mr. Scholz has said. You can offer job opportunities via the labor exchange, via the social affairs office. You can offer childcare facilities, etc., and so on. And then they will be targeted to a certain population. But you can only do if you get a meaningful distribution of people across the country. And then you can try and bring people back to the labor market. And this could work on a rather low level. Low-key profiles like €1 per hour jobs, which exist in this country, because we don't run the risk of threatening regular employment. So bring people close to the labor market, train them well, and also offer partial qualification measures. So we're having a very hard time with people that have not been going through the traditional dual-track training system of this country, although people still may be excellent carpenters or joiners. Good projects already get underway with the chambers of commerce, the different county administrations, chambers of industry as well, and chamber of crafts. But 50% of people will still be unemployed after 5 years. In other words, it's not going to be a reality that we're going to create jobs overnight. It will be taking many years. Well, Mr. Ruger, I have a question for you there. We're distributing refugees with the exception of young people, but they're distributed across the country in a decentralized fashion before we know what their skills and abilities are. And this is the problem with the residence rule that is often discussed. In Berlin, and I've seen for myself, there are people that are working in agriculture. What are you doing to do with them in Berlin, where there is no agriculture? Or they are in the Brandenburg region, where they have urban professions. Now, you should swap people around. It makes no sense. So either you consider the qualifications before you distribute people across the country, but when it comes to the residence rule, you need to know for how many years you want to have people stay in one city or town. But there's one more case that I'd like to briefly touch on. We have an excellent example here. At Mr. Fiebig's place, Jasmine Taylor and GT Touristics. She fled the Gulf War when she was 17 years old at the time from Persia. And she spoke no German. She learned German in external time, went to America, went to university, now owns her own company with 65 people, and she's a successful businesswoman, entrepreneur. In other words, these cases do exist. And in my company, we have ladies from Bosnia that have fled the country with their family after the Kosovo and Bosnia war in the 1990s. So it's a number of years, yes, they have passed, and now they're fully integrated in society. You can only see in her name that she was not an original German or German-born. Now, since we've been talking about success stories, let me still take a step back and look at challenges here. Lack of skilled labor cannot be solved by integrating more refugees. So that's the general tenor. But still, how can we make sure that the labor market can absorb them, although they're not going to help us in this acute shortage of skilled labor? And what are the challenges? I'll be happy to open this up for our audience here. Can I put up question number 13, please, on screen to have your vote again? This is a TED survey, and please only press your button once I've given you the signal to do so. It says, what do you think is the greatest challenge in the professional integration of refugees in the tourism industry? Is it 1, lacking language skills, missing professional qualifications, number 2, number 3, lack of support during job search, number 4, lack of jobs and the existence of the minimum wage, 5, discrimination and racism, or number 6, refugees' lack of willingness to integrate. So please go for 1 and press now. Now that is clear. And it's very much in line with what we've talked about. 52%. Little more over half of the audience believe that Lacking language skills are the biggest problem, but also discrimination, racism, lacking support during job search, etc. Well, maybe we continue with that. You said before also that languages do matter. Mr. Scholz, what about the minimum wage in this country? Well, I'm not going to spill a secret here when policymakers or economists are saying that to boost integration, the minimum wage should be reduced or be suspended, as we do for the long-term unemployed. Is that feasible, or is it a dead-end street? Well, it's a justified question. If you look at how long we need to work with people first until they have understood our working processes and procedures, because after all, we are a business, right? We're not a welfare office. We are a taxpayer ourselves as well. So we have to work economically efficient. So ideally, you would have to factor in a wage markup in order to guarantee those people receive the minimum wage. So we'll be grateful to find candidates to fill jobs. We've been taking, it has taken us a long time to find helpers in the catering side of our operations, and obviously to them we have to pay the minimum wage. Otherwise, we'll be liable if we didn't. And I'm sure many people would hire staff quickly if we had not, if we didn't have that minimum wage, or we could get it subsidized by a number of state grants. And I think that would be a great help, especially for small or medium-sized enterprises. Well, but let's take a glimpse into the future and realize what needs to be done. You said, you know, you have to be realistic, go forward with it. But where do you think in the tourism industry you could start? Where can the tourism industry make a tangible contribution to integrate people into the labor market? Well, we've talked about what does it require you to be integrated. And, well, the audience has just said it by pushing the button on the remote. It's training. It's language training. It's language courses. It's cultural integration what matters. And then I'm sure it's going to work. And I'm not seeing any problems there at all. But in order to get from A to B, I think it's going to be quite a few problems on the way. It's a long, fairly long process. Something we can do as the travel industry, which is very much dedicated towards understanding the understanding of peoples. We're building bridges between different nations and cultures. This, if you will, is our everyday business. What we've done over those past decades, namely to develop an understanding of foreign cultures, is, if you will, not always has not always been very successful. If you look at what's happening in other regions of this country, but generally, I think we should be well advised to exercise this tradition also for the newcomers in this country here when we deal with them in this country, and then I'm sure we'll be very happy we've had a chance to integrate them. But you know, let me say this again: we shouldn't be overly romantic about hanging on to those ideals, because many of us, or many of them arriving now in this country, will be dependent on our social welfare payments. They cannot be integrated quickly overnight. It will work well for the younger generation, but those who are older than 20 today, they have to realize that this is going to be a painstaking way forward for many, many years. Mr. Fiebig has said that education and training and ongoing training is very important, and the chambers of commerce are doing that. So for you, what would you say? Where can you do more or something else in order to support people from now on? In Berlin, we have a number of projects for refugees to the tune of 2 million euros, with which we want to boost the training skills of refugees. But if you start with languages, Well, we have to start from day one, as soon as people arrive in this country. For everyone, even those who return back to their home countries. We just read on the news that 3,000 Iraqis return to their home countries every day, but they benefit from those language skills as well when they return. So we need to train everyone. Then, once we have the language qualification of level B1 and B2, we need to get them to brush up those skills further to level C. Also true for vocational schools. And a lot of flexibility has been demanded here earlier. I'm a proponent, and I'm saying that personally off the record, of modular systems. So I think we should also critically think about our education system in this country. Possibly create many more modules, digital modules. For every job profile, we should have a digital element, different modules that you can shift around. Makes it easier for you to introduce also special language courses for people in need. And then what you need is networks of our SMEs who are in permanent contact with other players on questions of integration, culture, etc. I mean, culture is a two-way street. It's for people who arrive here to learn about our culture, but we need to learn about the incoming culture as well. Now, once the conditions are there and prerequisites are met, and they will be in some cases, we need a reliable set of indicators of the length of residence of people in this country. Training makes no sense if you know that someone is losing their residence permits after 3 years and are leaving the country. So it's very important for both sides of the equation, both for the apprentices who are trying very hard to make a good job, while they want to be sure that this pays back to them. And the same is true also for the training organization. We don't have this set of instruments at the moment. The residence times are very short, I think 2.5 or 3 years, and then their residence title will be scrutinized again. But then who's going to train them if they know that they're going to leave after so and so many years? So I think, again, this is true for both sides, and we need a better standard that makes it easier for people to be trained and then integrated into the labor market. So unfortunately, we have come close to the end of our meeting here, and therefore, allow me to ask a question to all of you here, just to get a very brief and poignant answer. What would be your message for the travel industry when it comes to the job integration or the labor integration of refugees in the years to come? Beginning with Mr. Ruger. Well, I wanted to say that before. Don't cling on to any illusions and make good use of the potential of the people who are willing to work, especially young people, and use the potential you have. You operate across the country, and if we get a good distribution of people in the country, all of you are contacts. You can make jobs available in the entire country, and that's probably not true for most other industries. And your job profiles that you offer are very much in demand and are probably going down well with refugees rather than if you were offering technical skills or technical jobs. Mr. Scholz, your message for the tourism industry. Jettison your stereotypes and preconceived notions. Look at people and make good use, as has been said today, of the potential of those people. All newcomers who have an interest in our industry should be embraced and welcome. Mr. Wiesenhütter, I agree. Take your time, be open-minded, and take more time than you usually would. And to reach out to people. Familiarize yourselves with people and their skills and find something to help them with. Mr. Fiebig, deal openly and in an open-minded fashion with people to create a foundation of trust, which is a good basis for integration. And at this point, I think, and really it's my feeling actually, the situation deteriorates a bit rather than getting better. We need to do more. We need to establish a welcoming society. If we are a welcoming society, things will work. The way to the contrary will be wrong, and no one would want that. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I think it has become clear that this issue is indeed a very complex one. But I thought we had a good chance to drill a little deeper, because it tells you where things need to be done, and we have heard about some positive projects there. This is the first time that this topic has been addressed at ITB, and I'm sure it's not going to be the last time either. In the years to come, we're going to address that, not only about challenges or solutions, but I think we can come up with specific success stories and solutions already. Thank you very much to our panelists today. Also, once again, many thanks to Mr. and Ms. Coody for volunteering to be interviewed by us. Thanks for your attention. I'd like to wish you an exciting CSR day and a successful ITB fair. Thank you.